For this section, we're going to be talking about solving quadratic equations in multiple ways. So to start off with, the first way, and the way that you've most likely seen in the past, is to solve a quadratic equation using factoring. So just a reminder, a quadratic equation is one that involves x squared as its largest degree or exponent. So to go through this, we have the first step is we need to move all of our terms to one side of the equation. Once we do that, we will get the equation now equal to 0. And once we get it equal to 0, we are going to factor all the terms that are on one side of the equation. And we do this because now we're going to have multiple terms multiplied together and equal to 0. And if you have multiple things being multiplied and the result is 0, then that means at least one of them has to be 0. You can't multiply two non-zero values and get 0. So at least one has to be 0, which means we can now set each of them equal to 0 and solve for the values, the x values, that cause that to equal 0. Okay, so those x values will solve the original problem by using this method. This only works with 0, so it is very critical that you always get one side equal to 0 to start the problem. So to start this off, we have x squared equals 5x plus 6. We're going to move everything to one side, and generally we want the x squared term to be positive. It makes things easier to work with, so we're going to move the 5x and the 6 to the other side by subtracting 5x and subtracting 6 from each side of the equation. And when we do that, we get x squared minus 5x minus 6 equals 0. Now that it's equal to 0, we can factor. We'll quickly use guess and check. We need x and x to multiply to give us x squared. We need two numbers that multiply to give us negative 6. So one of them will have to be positive and the other negative. And we need the values to add up to give us negative 5. So we should choose negative 6 and positive 1. 1 times negative 6 is negative 6. 1 plus negative 6 is negative 5. Okay, so you could do a check off to the side if you wanted to make sure, but since this is just an intermediate step in the problem, the check is not required. So now that it's factored and the result is equal to 0, that means each factor can be set equal to 0 and solved for. So solving x plus 1 equals 0, we'll subtract 1 from each side to get x equals negative 1. And then we'll add 6 to each side over here to get x equals positive 6. So the two answers that solve this original problem are x equals negative 1 and x equals positive 6. You could double check this by plugging each of these values in separately, so plug in negative 1 for each of your x's, and then plug in 6 for each of your x's, and you will get a correct answer. You will get one number equal to itself, which will verify that you found the correct answers. Alright, so with that, we'll go ahead and try some more. I want you to take a moment, pause the video, and see if you can't solve 4x squared plus 9 equals negative 12x. Alright, so the first thing we need to do is get one side equal to 0. So to do that, we're going to add 12x to each side of the equation, which leaves us with 4x squared plus 12x plus 9 equals 0. Now we want to factor this. You could use the middle out method for this, as it'll be a little bit more complicated than a normal factoring problem with guess and check, but this is one of our special factoring cases. It's not the difference of squares, but it does simplify pretty easily. So the way this works is we need two numbers that multiply to give us 4x squared. So we could try 2x and 2x. We could also try 4x and x, but again, this is one of our special cases. We need two numbers that multiply to give us positive 9, so we could try plus 3 and plus 3. And now let's do a quick check. 2x times 2x is 4x squared. 3 times 3 is 9. And then to get our middle term, 2x times 3, when we distribute the 2x, would give us 6x. And then when we distribute this 3 times 2x would give us 6x again. When we add those values together, we do get 12x. So it does work out. If that was a little too complicated for you, this is one of our harder special factoring cases. Then again, just use the middle out method like we've discussed in previous videos, and it will work out rather easily with the middle out method. So now that this is factored though and equal to 0, we can set each factor equal to 0, but this is only required once because it's the same factor times itself. You don't need to set it equal to 0 twice. You're solving the same equation twice if you do. So we're just going to solve 2x plus 3 equals 0 one time by subtracting 3 from each side to get 2x equals negative 3. And then we're going to divide each side by 2 to get x alone, which gives us x equals negative 3 halves. And that is our answer. Again, you could check it in the original problem to make sure it works out, and it will. I definitely recommend that you always check these problems when you finish them, as it's a way to guarantee that you did find the correct answer before you turn it in. Okay, so from here, let's go through the next method, which is the square root property. So the square root property says if you have some equation, a squared equals b, then you can get rid of this square by taking the square root of each side of the equation, or more technically, applying the square root function to each side of the equation. But when you do this, you won't just get a equals the square root of b. Remember, you had a squared equals b. There are two numbers that could give you that a squared. Remember, when you square anything, you get a positive answer, but that doesn't necessarily mean you started with a positive answer. You could have started with a negative, and that square canceled off the negative. So you have to account for the fact that there could be two answers here because of that square. So we have to say a is equal to plus or minus the square root of b. Two separate answers because we started with the a squared. All right, so if we apply this to some problems, we have 4x squared equals 64, and we want to solve this using the square root property. Well, the first thing we're going to do is get x squared alone by dividing each side by 4, which leaves us with x squared equals 16. And from here, to get x alone, we apply the square root property. The square root of x squared will just leave us with x, but when we apply the square root property to 16, we get a plus or minus the square root of 16. Again, because we started with the square, we have two possible choices, a positive and a negative. So simplifying this, we get x equals plus or minus 4. So x equals 4 and x equals -4 are the two answers for this problem. Again, a check is always a good idea on these problems, and if you were to check this, both of these answers will work out. All right, from here, go ahead and take a moment. Try out this next problem, 16x squared plus 9 equals 0. Okay, so the first thing we have to do is start getting this x squared alone. We'll start by subtracting the 9 from each side to get 16x squared equals -9. From there, we'll divide each side by 16 to get the x squared alone, which gives us x squared equals -9 over 16. We can then apply the square root function to each side of the equation, which gives us x equals plus or minus the square root of -9 over 16. And at this point, it's important to remember imaginary numbers. If you have the square root of a negative number, remember that means you can take the negative out of the square root and replace it with an I, the imaginary unit I. So we get x equals plus or minus I times the square root of 9 over 16. From here, the square root of 9 over 16, there are a couple of ways to approach this. First of all, you could think what number times itself gives you 9 over 16, which would just be 3 over 4. But the more technical way to approach it, without any guessing, is you're allowed to break up a square root over the top and bottom of your fraction, meaning the square root of 9 divided by the square root of 16. And from here, we know that the square root of 9 is 3, the square root of 16 is 4, so we have plus or minus I times 3 over 4, and we just need to write this in our complex number notation from here. So x equals plus or minus 3/4 I. So x equals 3 over 4 times I, and x equals -3 over 4 times I are the two solutions to this original problem. Continuing on with this, our next method is the quadratic formula. The quadratic formula is basically the best way to go about solving any of these problems. Whenever you have a quadratic equation that you want to solve, this is the most common way to approach solving it. It takes a lot more work, but it is an exact formula, which is very nice, and it also requires that you memorize the formula. So the quadratic formula says, given ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0. So you have your quadratic equation set up equal to 0. Then it is automatically true that x is equal to -b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. It requires no factoring. It is purely an arithmetic problem as soon as we find a, b, and c. So, working on this problem, -x squared equals 2x minus 3. To start it off, we have to get one side equal to 0, so we will add x squared to each side, which gives us 0 equals x squared plus 2x minus 3. We now need to know what a, b, and c are. A is the number in front of x squared, which is 1. b is the number in front of x, which is 2, and c is the number by itself, the constant, which is -3. So plugging these into our formula, we have x equals -b, so -2, plus or minus the square root of b squared, which is 2 squared, minus 4 times a is 1 again, times c is -3, all over 2 times a is 1. Now we just have to simplify this. So starting off, negative times 2 is just -2, plus or minus the square root of, now we need to remember our order of operations. 2 squared, we take care of the exponent first. Normally you would take care of parentheses first, but there's nothing inside any of these parentheses. These two parentheses are being multiplied, so that's the multiplication step. We'll take care of that next. So 2 squared is 4. -4 times 1 times -3 gives us positive 12. And that's all over 2 times 1 is 2. We'll keep simplifying this. So x equals -2 plus or minus the square root of 4 plus 12 is 16, all over 2. So we get -2 plus or minus the square root of 16 is 4, all over 2. And now we have to break this up into 2 separate problems. So I'm going to move this up here. We have -2 plus 4 over 2, and we also have -2 minus 4 over 2. X is equal to both of these values. So -2 plus 4 gives us positive 2 over 2, and -2 minus 4 gives us -6 over 2, which means x is equal to 1 and -3. Those are the 2 solutions to this original problem, (x squared equals 2x minus 3). All right. So go ahead and take a moment. Try to solve (x squared minus 2x equals 1 using the quadratic formula. Okay, so from here, we need to move everything to one side, and we generally want the x squared term to be positive, so we are going to add x squared and add 2x to each side, which gives us 0 equals x squared plus 2x plus 1. At this point, we need a, b, and c. A again is just 1, b is 2, and c is 1. So we get x equals (b) is -2, plus or minus the square root of b squared is 2 squared, minus 4 times a times c means -4 times 1 times 1, all over 2 times a gives us 2 times 1. Continuing with simplifying this, we'll move this up to the top right. We have -2 plus or minus the square root of 2 squared is 4, minus 4 times 1 is just -4, all over 2 times 1 is 2. Simplifying this, we get negative 2 plus or minus the square root of 4 minus 4 is 0, all over 2. And the square root of 0 is just 0. 0 times itself is 0. So we get negative 2 plus or minus 0 over 2, which simplifies to just negative 2 over 2, meaning x is equal to just negative 1. Whenever you go through these quadratic problems, you have three possible solutions. You can get 0 solutions, meaning no solution. You can get one solution like we did here, or you can get 2 solutions like we did in the previous problem. All right, so at this point, we can now talk about the last type of case of solving a quadratic equation, which is to solve by completing the square. This is the most complicated method, no doubt about it, but it is useful when we start talking about how to graph quadratic equations and quadratic functions. So it is important to know how to go through this process. So to begin with, to solve by completing the square, the first thing that we have to do is get x squared plus bx equal to c, meaning we need x squared plus bx on one side of the equation, and then we need the constant value on the other side. From here, if we are given ax squared in our initial step, we need to factor out that a. We have to have just x squared plus bx. If it's ax squared plus bx, you have to factor a from each of these terms before you can proceed. Once we do that, we are going to check what value is multiplied to our x. So that's our b value. We are going to take that b value, divide it by 2, and then square that result. When we do this, we will take that value that we find and add it to each side of the equation. So we'll end up having x squared plus bx plus b over 2 squared equals c plus b over 2 squared. And the reason why we do this is because x squared plus bx plus b over 2 squared will always factor into x plus b over 2 squared. It is always a perfect square polynomial that will factor into this form. And because we've done that, we can then solve by applying the square root property. Okay, now I know what you must be thinking. Why on earth would we go through all of this when we could just apply the quadratic equation or something along those lines, or just factor it? But again, when we get to graphing quadratic equations, or quadratic functions that is, it is extremely important that you know how to use the completing the square property in order to go through graphing them. It will give us a certain form for the quadratic functions that'll make graphing it much, much easier. Okay, so we're going to try a couple of equations with this. We have 2x squared plus 8x plus equals 6. So the first thing we have to do again is get x squared plus bx by itself equal to some constant. Well, that's already done for us in this problem. The 6 is already by itself on the other side of the equation. The next thing we have to do is to make sure that x squared has a 1 in front of it, meaning it's just by itself. In this case, it's not. There's a 2. So we have to factor out that 2, which gives us 2 times x squared plus 4x equals 6. And now we can get rid of the 2 by dividing each side of the equation by it, leaving us with x squared plus 4x equals 3. And at this point, we can now begin completing the square. We're going to take the b value, which is 4. We will divide it by 2 and then square the result. This is always the pattern. Divide by 2, square the result. So that gives us 2 squared, which is 4. 4 is what we add to each side of the equation. 2 is what goes in the parentheses when we factor it. So we have x squared plus 4x plus 4 equals 3 plus 4 again. We add 4 to each side of the equation. And now we factor x squared plus 4x plus 4. We said we'll factor into x plus 2 quantity squared. And that's equal to 3 plus 4 is 7. From here, to solve for x, we can use the square root property. On each side, we will apply the square root function, which gives us x plus 2 equals plus or minus the square root of 7. And finally, we will subtract 2 from each side to get x equals negative 2 plus or minus the square root of 7. Negative 2 plus the square root of 7 and negative 2 minus the square root of 7 are the two solutions to this original problem. Go ahead and take a moment, try to find x squared minus 8x plus 13 equals 0, using completing the square. Okay, so trying this together, first thing we have to do, get x squared minus 8x alone. We will subtract 13 from each side of the equation, which gives us x squared minus 8x equals negative 13. Now we will check if there's anything in front of the x squared. There is not, so we can continue. At this point, we will take negative 8 and divide it by 2 and square the result, which gives us negative 4 quantity squared, which is 16. And remember, we add the 16 to each side, so x squared minus 8x plus 16 equals negative 13 plus 16. And now what's inside the parentheses, this negative 4, is what goes inside the parentheses with the x when we factor. So we get x minus 4 quantity squared equals negative 13 plus 16 is positive 3. We can now apply the square root function to each side of the equation, which gives us x minus 4 equals plus or minus the square root of 3. And finally, we will add 4 to each side of the equation, which gives us x equals 4 plus or minus the square root of 3. So 4 plus the square root of 3 is one answer, and 4 minus the square root of 3 is the other answer.